Hello and welcome to the myMix webinar, What Signals to Send for a Personal Monitor Mix, or How to Feed Your Musicians a Well-Balanced Diet. We thank Mike for hosting this webinar. My name is Christian Glück. I'm the product manager for myMix Personal Monitor Mixing System. We'll go through the webinar. At the end, you're more than welcome to ask any questions that you have regarding personal monitor mixing systems. myMix was launched in 2010, and since that time, thousands of happy musicians and engineers are enjoying using myMix. As you can see, we have many users all around the world, and while the majority of them is in the houses of worship market, there's also operas, musical broadcasters, and even a Formula One racing team using myMix. Now, before we start talking about which channels to select, let's take a look at the differences between a main mix and a personal monitor mix. The first big difference is in the signal chain. This is very different. In the main mix, the signal from the microphone after the console is sent to the PA system. From there, through the speakers, into the venue, and engineers and audience are listening to it with their open ears. In monitors, the signal is picked from the console to the personal monitor mixing system, and from there, through the in-ear monitoring, directly into the ear. There is no room influence or any speaker involved. The targets of the mixes differ even more. In one case, the main mix has to deliver a good and equal sound for everybody in the audience. The personal monitor mix is there to support and enhance the performance of the individual musician. And while there are some common standards for a good sounding main mix, the judgment of the personal monitor mix is purely individual. Last but not least, the person mixing and their mindset. The engineer is observing the concert and analyzing channel for channel, so his focus is clearly on the left brain side. But when we perform music, our brain is using mainly its right side. This is very important to understand, as well as to understand that the musicians are on stage to perform, not to mix. The mix shall enhance and support the performance, but this is not the main subject. So now let's get back to our channels. How many channels shall you have for your personal monitor mixing system? The same as you use at your front of house console? 24, 32, 40 or even more? Now, myMix can handle 500 audio channels. That's not the problem, but too many channels will overwhelm and distract the musicians. So it is very, very important that you keep that in mind. It doesn't matter whether you got 24, 30, 40 or 60 channels, but throwing them as a one-to-one to the musicians will definitely not help them but create new problems. So, now let's ask the musicians what channels they like to listen to. The drummer will want, of course, a drum kit, maybe a click, bass, guitars, vocals, and maybe some keyboards. Vocalists, of course, the vocals, some guitars, keys, drums, bass. The guitarist, of course, the guitar, drums, bass, vocals, and keyboards. And the bass player, similar as the drummer, with click, guitar, keyboards, and so on. So pretty much every musician wants everything. So that's coming back to the point. Do I need to feed all the channels that I have of front of house to the musicians? Now, don't forget, that's what the musicians want to hear. And hearing doesn't mean having to control in all details. So, in order to please all the musicians but not to overwhelm them, we recommend to offer the individually important channels and consolidate or submix the individually less important channels. The target should be to have about 10 to 12 control channels per musician. Now, it can be more or less, but that should be your target in order not to overwhelm. Now there is one feature of myMix that helps the musicians from the other side. Meaningful names instead of numbers. So every input into a myMix system, whether it's on a myMix unit itself or on the input expander, can be named with something meaningful to the musicians, like vocal or guitar. All these channels' names show up on the Remote Channel Select page, and each and everybody can now select the channels that they want to use for the mix and turn off the other ones that they don't even want to see on their screen. Now let's look at our first example. We have a band here with a typical setup, 8 people on stage in total. So we have a bass, a guitar, a keyboard, a drum kit with a total of 8 microphones, a solo mic, an acoustic guitar, and 4 other vocal microphones. So a total of 18 channels at the front of house console. And now let's look how this translates into channels for our personal monitor mixing system. In our example, we feed kick and snare drum as direct channels to the system and use hi-hat, the 3 toms and the overhead microphones to create a submix on the console and feed that as a stereo drum kit to the monitors. You could also do this as a mono signal, but if you have channels available, we recommend to use it in stereo. To create a stereo mix with 2 auxes, you need to use the level settings of the aux sense. So the hi-hat we set at the same levels, so this will appear in the center. The first tom we put a little bit more on the right side, so more level on aux 2, while the second tom we put again in the center with even levels on both auxes. Tom 3 we put a little bit to the left, more level on aux 1, and the overhead left is full on aux 1 and the overhead right is full level on aux 2. The same way we use auxes 3 and 4 to create a stereo submix of the vocals. Bass, guitars, solo mic and keyboards are fed directly to the myMix system. Now let's see how this channel layout translates to the individual channel selection of the musicians. The drummer takes kick, snare and his stereo drum kit plus the other channels together with a click, a total count of 10 channels on the screen. The bass player has a similar channel selection, but because he's singing as well, he doesn't use the vocal subgroup, he uses the individual vocal microphones, with a total of 13. The vocalists have a similar selection as the bass player, but without the click for a total of 12 channels. And finally keyboards with a channel count of 9. Another unique feature of myMix that comes in very handy are the local network inputs and each and every mixer. These 2 inputs can take microphone or line level sources, and these channels become available for each and everybody on the network. So if you want to use more channels in your personal monitor mixing system, just think about all the DI boxes with line level signals where you just take the link through with a 1/4-inch cable directly into the next myMix. And if you plan to use a microphone signal, you just use a split box to share the signal between the console and the myMix. These channels are in addition to the signals from the input expander and can help you to achieve a better selection for your musicians. So in our example, we're using the drummer's myMix for the input of the click track and to split the hi-hat microphone. Then we use a second myMix to get in the acoustic guitar and the bass guitar, and finally the keyboard. Out of a total of 22 channels, the drummer can now select much better than before. There is kick, snare and hi-hat as direct signals, the submix is only the toms and the overheads are a stereo channel. With a total of 12 he has much more control about his drum kit. 2 free channels of the input expander we use now to create a stereo submix of the entire drum kit for everybody else. The bass player has now a similar selection as the drummer, with the same detail in the drums with an individual hi-hat microphone. For the vocalists it's getting even easier because now they just select the stereo submix of the drums, while still having the same detail in all their vocal microphones. And for the keyboarder, it's getting easier as well, because now there is a submix of the drums and a submix of the vocals, so there's only 7 channels to control on the mix screen. But not only to expand the system, also for standalone use, the local inputs of the myMix are very handy. Take an SD card with a multi-track recording of your band, connect your local inputs, and just rehearse at home without even having your band around you. Or take a simple inexpensive switch and just connect a few myMixes together to have a small band rehearsal, or consider your youth group using that on a Wednesday afternoon. Speaking of, you can take any myMix devices and connect 1, 2 or 3 of them together and use them as a standalone mixing system, like here with 3 myMixes for 3 microphones and 3 guitars, using one myMix for the main speakers and the other one for the monitors. Each myMix has an SD card slot for firmware updates and multi-track recording, playback and play-along. You can record up to 18 tracks as 24-bit 48K timestamped WAV file, 16 channels that you elect from the network, plus your stereo mix. The combination of multi-track recording, local inputs and the decentralized network architecture allow myMix to be used integrated or standalone. So whether you use it on stage for the big system, or you take a small system out for the youth group or rehearsals, or you have the myMixes as individual units for the musicians to practice at home, the flexibility and scalability of myMix is second to none. So now let's look into our second example, a large band with strings, horns, choir and some solo microphones. There are 2 guitar players, 2 acoustic guitar players, 2 keyboards, piano, 4 solo mics, a full choir with 8 person, a string ensemble, 2 saxophones, trumpet, trombone and 2 playback channels, so a total of 42 channels. So now you might be surprised to see as a recommendation for the personal monitor mixing a number of 50, which is even more. The trick is that each and every person is selecting different channels to have the individual important ones under control and just hear the other signals. This will become more transparent when you look at the channel selections of the individual musicians. So the drummer selecting the individual drum channels and a submix of all the other instrument groups. Including the click track, the drummer has a total of 14 channels to control. The violins, they can select each and every violin individually, therefore they have a rhythm group which contains of drums, bass and all the guitars and keyboards that they wouldn't consider what to do with them anyway. The choir has a selection of the individual vocal microphones, therefore they get the entire band as a submix. The individually important channels are available to them. Everything else is consolidated to make their life easy. And the same goes for the solo microphones. The individual channels are available, everything else consolidated into a few simple channels to control. Piano and keyboard players have their individual channels available plus submixes of the instrument groups. And the bass player can select individual drum channels if he likes that for his mix. So you see, if you got 50 channels in your monitor mixing system and you apply them right, it makes the life for the musicians easier. Now, having some free channels available can improve the communication between engineer and musicians significantly with myMix integrated intercom system. The engineer can create individual profiles to talk to individual musicians like the drummer, the bass player, the guitar player, or to the entire group at once. To set this up, he's using the profiles on his local myMix. myMix is using the channel name to identify whether a channel is selected or not. So having individual channels for the same talkback mic allows different people to select and listen to it. So in the profile talkback drums, the local microphone is called talkback drums. The drummer sees that channel and selects it. Everybody else sees that channel as well, but they deselect this channel. So with this channel now, the front of house engineer is only talking to the drummer. In a second profile, he can call this microphone talkback bass. And the bass player picks that microphone and brings up the volume. Everybody else deselects that channel. So now the front of house is only talking to the bass player. And you can imagine this can go for each and everybody or the entire group as well. From time to time, we get the request that people want to mix more than 16 channels. So that's not a problem with myMix. Let's say the drummer wants to create a submix for the band himself. So all he needs to do is take a second myMix, select all the drum channels, create a stereo mix using level, pan, tone and FX Sense, and send this mix back to the network. On the second myMix, he selects that stereo mix and adds the other instruments he wants to hear. While he has now full control about the drum kit and all the other instruments, everybody else in the band can select whether they pick the stereo submix from the drummer or if they also want to take some individual channels. So with 16 on one and 14 on the second myMix, you can control up to 30 channels if you like. myMix is offering outstanding audio with a maximum of flexibility. All audio transport is happening as uncompressed 24-bit 48K WAV file. Built-in stereo effects allow for an in-ear mix in 3D sound quality. myMix can be used standalone or integrated. When used with the main console, you can use the local inputs in addition to the inputs from the input expander. myMix connects with each and every console, whether it's analog or digital, including MADI and Dante networks. myMix can be used with simple Ethernet switches. No need for a proprietary special part. But if needed, it can be integrated into existing networks and audio transport can happen over miles. myMix is fully scalable, and as you add inputs or mix outputs, you can have up to 250 devices with 500 audio channels on the network. So let's take a look at the system components. There is a myMix mixer with 2 inputs and 2 outputs, the IEX16L 16-channel input expander for analog or digital inputs. You can use standard fast Ethernet switches. Also, we do have some recommended models, especially with power over Ethernet. The myMix Control web browser-based interface for remote control and remote configuration. The RX2 rack mixer that can be controlled through myMix Control. Just perfect to get stereo mixes to remote locations. And finally, the myMix install that operates like the myMix itself in a surface mount chassis. So now let's take a look into the questions that we received during this webinar. Are there phasing issues when using a submix and one of the individual channels together? That's a pretty good question because in theory this is exactly what would happen. Now if you look at the examples before, you can also see that the musicians were either selecting the individual channels or the submix. So in this case they're clearly avoiding that subject. Do you have specific EQ or effect settings that should be used in monitors? Now that's a tricky one because my guidance is that the best EQ is no EQ because whatever you apply, it is only a band-aid. The detailed answer to that is given in one of our webinars. If you go to the mymixaudio.com website and you go to In Actions and Webinars, this is where you find all our webinars, and the first one is talking about the fundamentals about in-ear monitor mixing. This will explain you why it is not EQ settings, but it is a combination of stereo effects and panning to create a 3D sound. Why does myMix not have built-in ambient microphones? The detailed answer to that you will also see in the webinar I mentioned before. The key is that the ambient microphone is there to get a feedback from the audience. Now, if you think, where is the drummer's unit? Right next to the hi-hat. What will this microphone pick up? Certainly not the signal that he wants to hear. So if you want to use some ambient microphones, that's why myMix has the local inputs and you can position them at a place where it makes sense. Are the effect sends in myMix per channel or global? Now, the effect type is global, whether this is a room or a reverb, but the send is in stereo per channel because that's the only way that you can create, in combination with a panning, a 3D sound image. And again, I'm referring back to the other webinar. So, thank you for joining the webinar. There is more information on our website. Thanks to Mike for hosting it, and hope to see you soon. Thank you. Bye-bye.